You knew what you were getting into. That was her greeting. No "Hello, John." No apology. No tears. Just that single sentence, spat out like a curse. I stood there in the living room, door half closed behind me, letting the echo settle in my head. She sat on the couch, arms folded, back too rigid, eyes distant, my heart hammered. And I felt an almost metallic taste in my mouth, like fear and anger fused together. I shut the door at last, click, and realized that I was staying. No matter how I ached to run, I was going to see it through. I call her Rachel, my wife, the woman who, 10 years ago, made me feel like the luckiest man in the world. But that night, with that one sentence, she might as well have been a stranger. I wanted to say something. Something cutting, something final. Instead, I walked over and set my phone face down on the table, a slow, deliberate motion. It was a sign. I'm here, I'm not running, and you won't hide from me. She raised an eyebrow. Maybe she sensed the shift in my stance. I could feel tension coiling in my shoulders, a clenched, electric energy that traveled down my spine. My mind rattled through the steps, the plan I'd made. The steps to kill any last shred of trust, because I wanted her to feel a fraction of the hollowness I'd been carrying. It wasn't just anger. I was beyond simple rage. This was surgical, controlled. I'd come to this moment with a strategy, and there was no turning back. A month ago, I caught her flinching at the sound of an incoming text. Middle of the night, phone hidden under her pillow, the glow lighting up her cheek. She didn't see me watching from the threshold, arms folded, breath trapped in my lungs, so I wouldn't give myself away. A name flashed. Mark, our local trainer from the gym, younger than me. Buff, tanned from his California days. Of course, she whispered something into the phone. Something that sounded like "I miss you," but was muffled by the pillow. In the present, we just stared at each other. Two strangers in the same house. The living room lamp cast shadows across her face, and I caught a flicker of regret in her eyes, or maybe it was just fear. I almost wanted her to cry, to fight, to deny everything. But she just sat there, pale and stiff, as if bracing for the final blow she knew was coming. She had said, "You knew what you were getting into." But for a time, I pretended I didn't. I'd brushed off the late calls, the new lingerie stuffed in the back of her drawer, the urgent shopping trips with no bags in hand upon her return. My gut told me something was off, but I refused to see it. Then it got worse. I remember one night I woke to the sound of the balcony door sliding open. I waited, counting each second. 10 minutes. 15. I crept to the window and saw her leaning over the railing, phone clutched in both hands like it was her lifeline. I watched her silhouette, the way her shoulders trembled, how her head tilted in a private conversation with someone far too important to wait until morning. Down below, near the row of garages, a man in a hoodie paced slowly, his phone also lit. He looked up only once, but it was enough for me to see his profile in the streetlight. Mark. My wife was talking to that man at 3 in the morning, while I stood just behind the glass, quietly unraveling. So I planned a test. I needed more than rumors in my own head. I needed facts. One day, I found a tuft of hair on my baby's blanket. Our child's hair. Our baby was only a year old. I felt like a monster even thinking it, but the suspicion churned in me like poison. I went to a private lab, slapped the envelope on the counter with my own hair sample, waited. The results came in an unassuming envelope with cold text. Paternity does not match. Not in big bold letters, not with any exclamation, just a straightforward statement that the child I'd been cradling every night, the child I'd doted on, might be someone else's. That's how science told me my life was a lie. I confronted her. She went gray in the face, literally sank to the floor in our kitchen. The baby in the high chair behind us gurgled obliviously. Rachel didn't try to explain. She just stared, wide-eyed, silent, hoping I would, shout, slam doors, throw a punch at the wall. I stood there, heart pounding like a war drum, and said not a single word. Eventually, I wrote in my personal notebook, +1 level of pain. Because that's what it felt like. Each new discovery was a rung on a ladder leading straight to hell. We functioned in that tension for weeks, sharing the same house, speaking as little as possible, each of us waiting for the other to break. She avoided me, avoided my eyes, avoided any real talk. Whenever the baby cried in the night, she jumped out of bed before I could, as if wanting to protect me from the awkwardness of fatherly duties. Or maybe she was too racked with guilt. Some nights, her phone glowed under the pillow, and she would rush out to the balcony again. Each time, I'd mark it down. Suspicion intensifies. Then came the final step. I had to lure him in. I needed him to show his face in my domain, to feel confident enough to step into my territory like he owned it. So I crafted a text, pretending it was from Rachel. John's leaving for a work trip. Gonna be gone a few days. I'm lonely. Miss you. And I made sure he'd read it as an invitation. I sent the message from her phone when she was in the shower, careful to delete evidence. The trap was set. I felt no remorse. My plan was straightforward. Let him walk into my house as though it were empty. Let him feel that arrogant triumph. And then I'd be there. The moment he revealed himself, I'd tear it all apart. He arrived late, the same night. I heard his footsteps in the driveway around midnight. I intentionally left the front door unlocked. A statement. Welcome to your downfall, Putty. I sat on the sofa with the lights off, listening to the baby's soft breathing from the nursery. Rachel was in the bedroom, or so I thought. The door clicked open. Slow footsteps. I inhaled, counting, every muscle in me coiled tight. I expected him to walk in alone. Instead, I heard her voice from the hallway. Mark. Her tone, hushed, but not fearful. It was welcoming, like she'd been waiting for him. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, forcing myself to remain calm. I needed to see, with my own eyes, what this was. Carefully, I got up and moved to the corner, just out of the ambient moonlight slanting through the window. She took his hand. I saw it. I saw how he slipped out of his jacket, revealing those broad shoulders. How she pressed up against him, her head against his chest. My stomach twisted. They exchanged a short, tense kiss. Nothing gentle about it. The air felt charged with their hunger. And that was it, the final blow to any illusions I still clung to. I watched them, my heart pounding so hard it nearly choked me. He leaned down, and I saw her eyes flutter closed. She murmured something I couldn't catch. Maybe his name, maybe a plea. But it was intimate. I was forced to face the truth. The bond she once shared with me was here, in front of me, with him. They stole a moment I'd always believed was ours alone. They began moving deeper into the house, into my domain, ignoring every boundary. I wanted to slam the lights on and unleash all the anger burning inside me. But I kept telling myself, wait, make it count. They crept down the hallway, toward the bedroom. I could hear the rustling of clothes, his low murmur. She gave a soft laugh, an almost carefree sound that cut deeper than any insult. Blood pounded in my temples. The next few minutes were a blur of muffled voices and suppressed moans. I didn't need to see the details to know exactly what they were doing. The walls felt paper-thin, the hush of their breathing against each other like a thunderclap in my ears. I'd never known such cold fury. I let it go on for what felt like an eternity. My soul felt shredded. But I decided from the start, if I were to walk away, I had to do it with absolute certainty. No regrets, no more illusions, so I let them have their moment. My last gift to her, in a twisted sense. When I finally flicked on the hallway light, I could hear the sudden scramble, the cursing, the hush. Then the door opened, and there he was. Mark, shirt half-buttoned, hair ruffled, eyes wild. My wife behind him, disheveled, color drained from her face. In that second, seeing their panic, I almost felt pity. Then that wave of pity evaporated. leaving only that controlled aggression thrumming beneath my skin. He stammered. "I didn't realize. I thought." Rachel said. I cut him off by tossing an envelope onto the hallway floor between us. The one with the paternity test results, reprinted so many times I could recite them from memory. He saw the bold letters, recognized the words, and froze. She looked from me to the envelope. Her hands started trembling. Rachel whispered, "John, let me explain." "Explain what?" I said softly. Too softly. My voice sounded alien even to me. "That the child I've been raising is biologically yours." I pointed at Mark. "Go ahead, say it. The truth. You owe me that." She let out a shaky breath. Mark's face went pale. For a fitness trainer full of swagger, he sure shrank in that moment. He tried to speak, but it came out as an incoherent mumble. Maybe he was expecting me to throw a punch or smash his face in. But I just stood there, an immovable presence, letting them both drown in their own guilt. Rachel brushed her hair away from her face, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. "John, I'm sorry. I never planned this. It just happened. It was never meant to go this far." I wanted to scream, to laugh in her face, to do anything. But I just repeated in my mind. Step 3. That was my final move. I gave a bitter half-smile and turned my gaze to Mark. "You should leave." He opened his mouth but stayed put. Maybe he thought he owed her some show of loyalty. Maybe he was stupid enough to think I wouldn't snap. I took one step forward. That was enough. He skittered back, grabbed his jacket, and looked at Rachel like he expected her to beg him to stay. She didn't. She just stared at the floor, tears clinging to her lashes, body rigid. Mark left. I heard the front door close, footsteps fading, and then it was just me and her in that suffocating silence. She tried to approach me, but I stepped back. The hallway light buzzed overhead, giving off a faint hum that sounded deafening in the tension. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. I didn't want this to end like some cheap betrayal. But it did," I said. My voice trembled on the edge of rage. "It ended exactly like that." She had no answer. I stormed into the bedroom, the place still warm from their presence. The sheets crumpled, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and perfume. I wanted to punch a hole in the wall, but forced myself to breathe, to think. I had to keep my last shred of control. I grabbed the baby's blanket from the crib in the corner of the room. My baby? A wave of heartbreak slammed into me, but I bit it back. That child was innocent in this. I'd loved him, fed him, watched him sleep, never questioning that he was mine. This new reality threatened to crush me. She stood in the doorway. "John, talk to me, please." I spun around. "Talk. After months of your lying, your sneaking around, your phone calls in the middle of the night." She bowed her head. He was just excitement. Something I needed because you seemed so distant. Distant. I repeated. My voice came out in a harsh whisper. I was working my ass off to keep us afloat, to pay bills, to build a future for our family. Everything I did was for you, both of you. That's exactly the problem. She shot back suddenly, a flash of anger in her eyes. You were always the caretaker, the problem solver. But I needed more, John. I needed. What? Passion. I laughed bitterly. That's what you wanted. And you found it in his arms while I was out earning a living. I took a step forward. She didn't move, but her eyes flickered with something like fear. I realized I was looming over her. I forced myself to step aside, to let some air between us. You want to know the worst part? It's that I love that baby. You don't get to kill that with your cheap fling. But you did. And now, everything's gone. She trembled. I could see tears threatening to fall. Part of me, a small dying part, wanted to reach out, to hold her, to calm her down. Then I remembered the image of her and Mark together, the memory of them kissing in the hallway. I clenched my jaw, turned away, and left her standing alone. The night crawled on. I sat in the living room, replaying every second of what happened. My phone buzzed a few times, calls from unknown numbers, maybe Mark's attempts to figure out what to do next. I didn't answer. I just sat there, lost in a swirl of heartbreak and adrenaline, a predator that had cornered its prey but wasn't sure how to deliver the final blow. She came out of the bedroom after an hour, wearing her robe, hair damp from a shower. She perched on the edge of the sofa, not close enough to touch me. "I know I can't fix this," she began quietly, "but I want you to know I never wanted to hurt you." I nearly laughed. "Well, you did. And now you're dealing with the consequences." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand if you want me gone." I just stared at the coffee table. Our wedding photo stared back at me from a small frame. We looked so happy, young, hopeful. The man in that picture had no clue what betrayal felt like, how it could slice through bone and sinew, straight to the heart. "Leave, stay, do what you want," I muttered at last. "It's too late for us." She inhaled sharply, as if she'd been stabbed. For a second, she almost spoke, but then she closed her mouth and nodded. She rose, slow, unsteady, and walked back to the bedroom, shoulders slumped. That was the pattern for the next few days. We occupied the same space, never quite meeting each other's eyes. She slept in the guest room. I drifted around the house like a ghost, haunted by the baby's cries, my fatherly instincts forcing me to check on him. But every time I saw his little face, my chest tightened, torn between love and betrayal. She tried to feed him, to keep the routine. We didn't talk, just coexisted in a tense, oppressive silence. I remember one night, I sat in the kitchen, a glass of bourbon in my hand. Couldn't sleep, couldn't even breathe properly. She walked in quietly and paused in the doorway. I heard her sniffle, but I refused to look up. Maybe she wanted to say something. Maybe she was hoping I'd invite her to talk. I took a slow sip, ignoring the tremor in my hand. She left, and I listened to her muffled sobs down the hall. By the end of that week, I knew what I had to do. I'd cling to the last bit of pride I had left, and I'd walk away from this house. From her. She'd made her choice. I didn't need an apology or an explanation that would never soothe my scars. And so I enacted my final plan, step 3 of my quiet war. I sent Mark a text message from my phone this time. "It's me. We need to talk. Come to the house tomorrow night. She'll be here alone. I'm leaving early." That was my lie, my final trick. I wanted him to show up again, but this time I'd be the one opening the door. I needed him to see that I was no longer the wounded husband he thought he could outmaneuver. The night came. I pretended to pack a suitcase, made noise, slammed the closet doors. Rachel hovered in the hall. "You're leaving?" "I've got a business trip," I lied bluntly, zipping up the bag with a flourish. "Be back, whenever." I didn't even try to make it sound convincing. She just nodded, too defeated to ask questions. I loaded the bag into the trunk, started the car, and pulled out of the driveway. Then I parked at the curb of Lockover, headlights off, engine silent. I waited. My phone pinged once, an uncertain text from Mark. "Are you sure it's safe to come over?" I didn't reply. He had enough confidence to try. I'd given him the bait. Sure enough, after half an hour, I saw a familiar silhouette pass under the street lamp. He approached the house, backpack slung over one shoulder like he was moving in. I killed the engine and quietly walked back through the side yard. I slipped in through the back door. The baby was asleep, the house mostly dark. From the living room, I heard Rachel's gasp of surprise. She obviously hadn't invited him. I stepped into the soft glow of a single lamp, locking eyes with Mark. His face paled. "John, you said," he sputtered, but I cut him off. "You came back," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. Rachel looked from me to him. Confusion etched into her features. "John, what? Why?" I held up a hand. "I texted him," I admitted calmly, just like I texted him before. "You think I didn't know you were seeing each other behind my back?" I set the trap from the start. Mark stiffened. You set me up. I nodded. I needed you both to show your real selves. Now there's no more lies, no more illusions. He looked ready to bolt, but I motioned for him to stay put. Then I faced Rachel, who was trembling. I did this because I wanted to see how far you'd both go, how easily you'd betray me again. And it turns out, it's easier than I ever imagined. She spoke in a trembling whisper. John, please. This is cruel. Is it? I said. I'm just giving you the freedom you've been longing for. No more hiding. No more secrets. Take him, if that's what you want. But I'm done. I let the final word hang in the air. In the hush that followed, I saw her face crumble. Mark started toward her, but she shrugged him off. That surprised me. She looked at me with wet eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. You have every right to hate me. But this is more than I can bear. I walked to the table, picked up the keys I'd left there. You should have thought about that before you made me live a lie. Then, as if to underscore my exit, I took one last look around the house I'd built with her. The living room where we'd spent lazy Sundays, the pictures of us on the mantel, the little toys scattered on the floor from a baby that wasn't mine. It all felt drenched in memories I could no longer stand. I turned and headed for the door. Mark just stepped aside, silent, not daring to meet my gaze. Rachel let out a choked sob behind me, but I kept walking. It wasn't anger that fueled me anymore. It was emptiness, a cold certainty that everything had died. I got in my car and drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. That night, I barely slept. My mind reeled with images, her voice whispering on the phone, the test results, the baby's soft coo in my arms, the taste of betrayal that still coated my tongue. I pressed my forehead against the window, felt the cold seeping in, tried to think of anything but them. My life had split at the seams, and I was free-falling into an unknown darkness. In the morning, I wrote a final note to myself. Level 0. A reminder that I had nothing left to lose. I showered, dressed, and checked out without breakfast, numb to any sense of routine. Before I left the parking lot, I opened my phone and saw a text from Rachel. Please come back. Let's talk. I stared at it, then deleted it. No reply. I drove aimlessly, ended up at an empty stretch of waterfront. The sky was overcast, gray waves lapping at the shore. I thought back to how Rachel used to love the sea breeze, how we once stood on a pier in Seattle, her hand in mine, dreaming of our future. Now it felt like someone else's memory, a life lived by a version of me that no longer existed. Eventually, I went to my old office. I had a key, the weekend security code. The building was mostly dark, deserted. I flicked on a lamp in my cubicle and just sat there, leaning back in my chair. A wave of exhaustion hit me. I considered the next steps: legal separation, custody arrangements, if that even applied, given the DNA test. My lawyer would have a field day with that. The thought made my stomach churn. I folded my arms, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe. My mind replayed the moment I found out the baby wasn't mine. That crisp line. Paternity does not match. The quiet brutality of scientific fact. I used to believe fatherhood was about more than genetics, that love mattered more. But as soon as I learned the truth, that love soured in my heart, replaced by bitterness. Could I have tried to fix it? To accept the baby anyway? Some men do. But the betrayal cut so deep that every time I heard him cry, I remembered Mark's face, Mark's hands on my wife. I hated that part of me. But it was there. I couldn't deny it. A phone call snapped me out of my spiral. My cell vibrated across the desk. I glanced at the screen. My mother. She lived back in Denver with my father, both aging and unwell. I ignored it. I couldn't bring myself to share this devastation with them. Not yet. I stayed in the office until dawn lit the windows, going over old spreadsheets, useless tasks just to pass the time. Then I decided. I'd go home one last time, gather my clothes, and leave for good. Let Rachel and Mark figure out their next move. Perhaps they'd raise that child together. Perhaps not. I no longer cared. When I finally arrived back at the house, the morning air was cool, the sky a dull gray. The driveway was empty. Good. I let myself in quietly, half expecting to find chaos inside. But the living room was in order, no sign of Mark. The baby was crying in the nursery, and I heard Rachel's soft, consoling voice. I slipped past, heading to the master bedroom to grab the essentials. She must have heard me because she called out, "John." I kept moving, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, mind blank. The memory of last night's confrontation felt strangely distant, like a bad dream. She appeared in the doorway, baby on her hip. Her eyes were puffy from crying, hair unkempt. I paused, looking at them both. The child reached a tiny hand out toward me, making those baby noises that used to melt my heart. Now I felt only a heavy ache in my chest. She spoke in a tired whisper, "Please, talk to me." I zipped the bag. "I have nothing more to say." "Where are you going?" I shrugged. "Away from here." She bit her lip, tears welling again. "I'm sorry. For everything. This was never what I wanted." I cast a glance at the baby, who gurgled and smiled, not understanding the turmoil around him. "He's innocent," I said quietly, forcing myself to look at her. "But I can't stay. I can't pretend anymore." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know." We stood there, locked in a moment of shared misery. I wanted to fling some final words, an accusation, something that would lighten the weight in my chest. But I felt numb, so I just turned and walked out. The door closed behind me with a soft click, like the last page of a book you never want to read again. For a moment, I hesitated on the porch, feeling the emptiness at my back. I was leaving a house filled with everything we once dreamed of, now soaked in bitterness. I got into my car and drove, not sure where I'd end up. The highway stretched out like an escape route. Each mile marker felt like a step further from that life I'd built. My phone buzzed occasionally. Messages from my boss, from my mother, from friends who'd begun to suspect something was wrong. I ignored them all. I watched the signs blur by and thought about how revenge sometimes isn't a fiery spectacle. Sometimes it's just letting them face the aftermath while you disappear, taking the last shred of your dignity with you. That realization hit me. My vengeance had been more about setting them up to reveal themselves, to implode in front of my eyes. Now that it was done, I felt free, yet hollow. Because at the heart of it, maybe I just wanted her to feel what it's like to be utterly alone, the way she made me feel even when we still shared a bed. I didn't care if it made me a monster. I was done being the victim. Hours later, I pulled into a rest stop by the ocean. Wind whipped my hair as I stood watching the waves crash. I tried to conjure memories of happier times, or laugh, our wedding day, the baby's first steps. But everything played in my mind like a broken reel. I sat on a bench, listened to the surf, let the bitterness drain out bit by bit. Maybe, in time, I'd feel something else. Grief, acceptance, regret. For now, numbness was all I had. My phone rang again. My mother. This time I answered. Her voice wavered with concern. "John, honey, are you all right? You haven't called. Your father's worried." I closed my eyes. "I'm fine, Mom." I lied. Just needed some space. Work stuff. I could sense she didn't believe me, but she let it slide. "Call when you can, dear." I hung up, feeling a sudden wave of longing for the simpler times. Childhood in Denver, no knowledge of betrayal or heartbreak. Then I opened the car door, rummaged in the glove compartment for a notepad. I scribbled a single note. Might see them again someday. Not today. Because I needed to remind myself that life goes on, no matter how broken it feels right now. Over the next few days, I drifted from motel to motel, as if searching for a place to settle. Sleep was fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. heard the hush of their voices, felt that flush of humiliation. Each morning, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, exhausted from dreams I couldn't remember. My phone calls were minimal, just enough to keep my boss from firing me. I told him I needed personal leave. He didn't ask details. I remember one morning I caught my reflection in a streaked motel mirror, a man with dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his jaw, no trace of the stable, upstanding guy who used to run 5 miles every sunrise. A wave of anger and pity for myself washed through me. I picked up the phone and punched in a familiar number. Rachel's. It rang and rang. No answer. I don't know what I would have said, anyway. I ended the call, feeling that old gnaw of heartbreak again. That same afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. "She's not okay. The baby misses you. I'm sorry." I stared at it, then realized it must have been Mark. My pulse spiked, and anger rushed in. What right did he have to text me? But the mention of the baby's longing for me somehow cut deeper than any insult. I deleted the message. He wanted me to come back. Or was he tormenting me? I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reply. Time blurred. Days, weeks, I'm not sure. Each one blurred into the next. I found myself constantly replaying everything, from the earliest suspicions to the final confrontation. My world had cracked, and I was sifting through the rubble. At some point, I realized that if I didn't find a way to move on, I'd be stuck in that bitterness forever. And I couldn't let them hold that power over me. One chilly evening, I stood by a lakeside in northern Washington, the sun setting behind the mountains. I thought about my father's face if he knew the truth about how my mother would react. Pity. Shame. I envisioned going back to that house, seeing Rachel's eyes, hearing the baby's cry. My heart stung. But I also knew I wouldn't turn around. Mistrust had carved itself too deeply into my skin. So I made a decision. I'd file for divorce, relinquish any rights to custody if that's how it played out, and restart my life. Maybe not in Seattle. Maybe somewhere else entirely. Denver, perhaps. My parents might need me soon. And maybe, just maybe, I needed them. The next morning, I called the lawyer. The conversation was brief. He asked the usual questions. Yes, there was infidelity. Yes, paternity test results exist. He told me it was a clear case. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to finalize the paperwork. Relief flickered in my chest, overshadowed by sorrow. But at least I had a direction. Once that call ended, I sat in the driver's seat and allowed myself a moment of grief. Tears sprang up, unexpected, stinging my eyes. I let them fall. No one was there to see, no one to judge. It was just me letting go. In the days that followed, I returned to Seattle briefly, long enough to gather the rest of my belongings with the lawyer's guidance. Rachel was out when I arrived. I left a note on the dining table. "I'm done. Whatever you choose from here is your choice, but I'm not part of it anymore. Don't reach out to me unless it's about the legal papers. Joan." I closed that door with a final sense of purpose. And so I parted ways with the life we built. The house, the wedding photos, the illusions of fatherhood. Everything. I found a small apartment near downtown, enough space to eat, sleep, and breathe while I sorted out the legal aftermath. The nights were quiet. Lonely. But I'd take loneliness over living with a traitor. Eventually, I got used to the quiet. I jogged in the mornings along the waterfront, letting the cold Seattle mist wash over me. I attended all the lawyer meetings, responded to emails, paid what needed paying. My ring stayed off my finger, locked in a drawer I never opened. One evening, Rachel tried to call. I sent it to voicemail. She left a trembling message about wanting closure, about the baby's health. I deleted it. I decided this was my closure. Maybe it was cruel, but I had no more to give. The divorce was swift, as predicted. No drawn-out battle. We had few assets together, just the house, the car, some joint savings. We sold the house. She moved somewhere smaller, presumably. The baby. I never asked for details. I was left with a chunk of money from my share of the sale, but it felt empty in my hands. I put it into a separate account and barely touched it. Sometimes I woke up in the dead of night, longing for the child's laughter, that weight of him in my arms. But then the memory of betrayal came roaring back, drowning out any sentiment. Over time, I recognized a cold truth. Vengeance, real vengeance, doesn't come with fireworks or some triumphant victory. It leaves you empty, having scorched the earth behind you. I'd done exactly that. I'd orchestrated her humiliation, forced them both to face me, and walked away. And that had been my freedom. No regrets, just emptiness where my heart used to be. Maybe that emptiness would one day fill with something new. Months passed. My parents kept calling, gently probing if I was okay. I made vague excuses, said I was busy with work. My father, never an emotional man, ended a call once with, "Son, come see us when you can." I heard the ache in his voice. Maybe soon, I told myself. Maybe soon I'd be strong enough. I found a new job, ironically a better position with a higher salary in another logistics company. ISTJ, my personality test said. Organized, methodical, precise. Perfect for the role. I poured myself into spreadsheets, deadlines, cost analyses. Anything to keep my brain too busy for regrets. People at the new office sometimes asked if I was married. I always answered, divorced, in a clipped tone. No details. The rain mark on my finger faded over time. The memory of her face still flickered in my mind at odd moments. In the hush before dawn, in the swirl of the city lights, in the cry of a child at a grocery store. Each time, my chest tightened, but it loosened a bit faster with every passing day. One afternoon, I stepped outside the office and felt the crisp autumn air. A sudden wave of clarity hit me. My life had restarted. I could do anything, go anywhere. I gazed up at the sky. The clouds parted just enough for a shaft of sunlight to hit the pavement. I inhaled deeply, thinking maybe the future wasn't so bleak. Maybe one day I'd build something new, with someone else, or alone. But it would be on my terms this time. I walked to my car, turned the ignition, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man who looked back at me was older, yes, but steadier. The bitterness in his eyes was softer now, replaced by a calm acceptance of reality. I spoke aloud to myself, words quiet but firm. You killed the trust. You let go of the illusions. It's done. And then I drove off, leaving behind the last remnants of that shattered story. If she ever truly understood the cost of her betrayal, I'd never know. Because I was free. That's how I learned that vengeance isn't about leveling the scales. It's about cutting yourself loose from the lies that weigh you down. Painful, yes. Messy. But in the end, there's a cold peace in walking away, letting that door shut for good, and never looking back.